think maybe we'll start. Good evening. My name is Barry Bergdahl. I'm a professor of art history here at Columbia. I'm new to this committee and therefore also new to this seminar, so I'm a complete novice at these introductions. I'm going to try to keep them brief because we've had a preview of the paper and it's enormously stimulating, and it actually even takes on to an extent, the namesake of our seminar. Tonight's speaker is Stefan Collini. I'm sorry, you can't hear me. Tonight's speaker is Stefan Collini. He is Professor of Intellectual History and English Literature at Cambridge, as well as a Fellow of the British Academy. I think you've read him not only in his books, perhaps among the most important, Absent Minds, Intellectuals in Britain, described in your program notes as a major analysis of the role of the intellectual and its place in British culture, received particularly widespread attention in both the academic world and the general media. It connects very much with what he's going to be presenting this evening. Also a almost brand new book, What Are Universities For? But also a frequent contributor to the British and the American press that's, and we might say, left as a place of vibrant discussion, the London Review of Books, the TLS, and The Nation. After he speaks, rather than have a second set of introductions, I'll introduce already our two respondents. Mary Poovey is Samuel Rudin University Professor in the Humanities and Professor of English at NYU. She has also a huge bibliography, but books include A History of the Modern Fact and Genres of the Credit Economy. At NYU, she founded the Institute for the History of the Production of Knowledge, which she currently directs. And then we'll hear from Bruce Robbins, who is professor here at Columbia, Old Dominion Foundation Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English and Comp Lit. His books include Perpetual War, and I think your talk this morning suggests, this afternoon suggests a kind of perpetual war. Perpetual War, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Violence, Upward Mobility and the Common Good, among others. He, too, is a frequent contributor to public places of discourse and exchange, including the London Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Public Books, among many, many others. So in each case, on this subject, really, of the public intellectual, I think also people who both think about it from the outside but perform it from the inside. So we're very much looking forward to the talk and the comments, and we'll try to leave ample room for all of you to engage with the debate in the second half. So hand it over to you, Professor Collini.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for that introduction. It's very nice to be asked to do the Trilling seminar, and I have to say, for me, it's partly a kind of act of expiation, because if there's one kind of figure that you feel a little guilty about, it's somebody who was very important to you in your reading when you were much younger, and then as you go on, you start to take issue with more or less everything they've said at one point or another, and find yourself feeling much more distant. And so this feels a little bit like coming home in that respect, to be able to pay my respects there. Now, my starting point for this evening's lecture is something that's very obvious and in some ways very familiar, but it's also, I think, puzzling and in some ways could be made troubling. If we consider many of the best-known pieces of cultural criticism from the mid-19th century to the present, and I'll say more about both the category and the examples in a moment, I think we're bound to be struck by a certain repetitiveness. And as a preliminary condensed description of the character of this repetitiveness, we could say the following. Critics repeatedly find themselves denouncing the reductive instrumentalism of the dominant discourse of their society, especially as instantiated by official statements and policies, but also more generally in the received wisdom of public debate. And in elaborating their critique, these critics make implicit appeal to some fuller or richer or otherwise more adequate conception of human life, against which the failings or shortcomings of the public discourse are being arraigned. But instead of setting out this conception in propositional form, they almost invariably, I think, fall back on some meta-discursive reflections upon the necessary elusiveness of any such ideal, or at least of its inherent resistance to brisk propositional statement. In its place, they resort to a variety of metaphors, images, and even catchphrases that seem to defer or evade the task of elaborating a more positive view, and which as a result have, I think, for us as readers, a tendency to be merely irritating. Any student taking an imagined cultural criticism 101 could readily identify the targets against which these critics have often written and enumerate many of the failings they've identified. But it would be more difficult for them, more difficult for us, I think, to give any fuller characterization of the values in the name of which these criticisms have been made. Now, insofar as this feature of their writing has been remarked, it tends to be seen, I suppose, as an intellectual or stylistic failing of the individual critic who's under the microscope at any particular moment. In this lecture, I want instead to look at the pattern of repetitiveness itself. And I want, rather than seeing this as a disabling weakness of the tradition of cultural criticism that I'm going to talk about, I want to ask whether there's a way we could see it as the mark of a kind of success, and perhaps the only kind of success which this cultural criticism really has aspired to. Now, my examples are going to be historical, but of course anyone who uses the category cultural criticism in the subtitle of a talk, anyone so unwise as to do that, knows that present concerns are not being entirely kept out of it, and I hope actually that this also does have some bearing, maybe as some heuristic device on how we might think about how we do this task today. So I want, with these examples, to reflect on the question of what success might mean in cultural criticism of this kind, and on what the recurring pattern tells us about both the constraints of public debate and the difficulties in representing non-instrumental values. And I want to suggest that there's a more than contingent connection between, on the one hand, the pattern of the criticism of instrumentalist goals in the name of something that seems to elude positive definition, and on the other, the various literary and rhetorical tactics for effective contribution to this kind of public debate. So let me begin with a couple of preliminary ground-clearing remarks to maybe save time in discussion later. Obviously, the term cultural criticism is now a semantic minefield. There are overlapping and discordant senses of it, and it has resonances for various people which will, in the end, determine responses to anything you say on the topic. I think within the American Academy in particular, the term now often connotes various forms of oppositional or dissident writing, often addressing or expressing issues of identity and drawing on one or other body of theory, and aimed at dissolving the false universalism of perspectives that may seem either more innocent or more sinister, according to taste. But sometimes it's just, of course, a fancy name for what English professors get up to when they're tired of writing about literature. I'm using it here in its much older and in a way more relaxed sense to encompass various forms of criticism of society that concentrate on reading particular cultural or symbolic forms of expression as symptoms of the state of health of that society. And as the buried metaphor of reading there suggests, this usually involves some attempted transfer of the operation of critical analysis from purely literary or other texts to the diagnosis of social and political life more broadly. But the reading is literal as well as metaphorical in its habitual focus on language, especially on the inadequate or impoverished conception of life held to be manifest in the inadequate and impoverished idiom of the dominant discourse. And as that casual reference to dominant discourse suggests, this criticism usually takes the form of some kind of polemical intervention in public debate rather than a learned or technical contribution addressed to a more specialized audience. And necessarily this requires special attention to questions of tone and its implicit appeal to or collusion with the reader. Something that is, I think, carried more by the adverbs than perhaps any other part of speech. And in this respect, I rather quaintly like to think of certain forms of cultural criticism as being principally adverbial criticism. Now, As far as examples go, I'm also going to take a very conventional and traditional set of examples to begin with. That's that line of cultural critics that runs, at least in Britain, from figures like John Ruskin and Matthew Arnold in the mid-19th century through to people like F.R. Leavis and Raymond Williams in the mid-20th. I do so not in order to celebrate or in any sense try to rehabilitate them. It's partly that they're the figures I happen to be most familiar with, but it's partly also, I think, that they are still taken as the essential points of reference, even when later critics may wish to repudiate or in some way supersede this tradition of writing. Now, I'm not going to provide yet another survey of the classic works that make up this tradition, but let me just very briefly, I know we're all very constrained for time today, very briefly point to a kind of shorthand by way of illustration here. One of the most celebrated attacks on the teachings and on the whole cultural authority of political economy in the 19th century in Britain was John Ruskin's little book, Unto This Last, published as a book in 1862. And Ruskin, as you probably know, was disputing not just the policy prescriptions drawn from the dismal science, but the larger question of the adequacy or relevance of its central categories. And he had his fun at the expense of the model of Homo economicus on which he took the science to be based. It's as plausible, he says, as a science of gymnastics which assumed that men had no skeleton. It might be shown on that supposition that it would be advantageous to roll them up into pellets, flatten them into cakes, or stretch them into cables, and that when these results were effected, the reinsertion of the skeleton would be attended with various inconveniences to their constitutions, and so on in that vein. He's suggesting, in other words, that the assumptions and starting points of political economy are simply implausibly removed from the reality of human life. But I think his writing becomes notably less playful, and you may even feel less clear, when he turns to characterize what would be a more adequate set of conceptions. As he famously put it, it's become something of a over-quoted slogan, there is no wealth but life. Life including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. Or, and another famous phrase, wealth is the possession of the valuable by the valiant. Well, to put it mildly, these do not seem altogether transparent phrases, and yet they seem to stand for something which is obviously structurally very important to Ruskin's argument. And I think this example also raises some interesting questions about what does count as success for the critic. The 4 chapters that make up Unto This Last were first published in the Cornhill magazine starting in 1860. And the Cornhill, which had been founded in the previous year, reached probably the widest audience of any of the main Victorian cultural periodicals at this date. But the necessary price of doing this was a degree of indulgence towards the convictions and sensibilities of a somewhat conventional and middle-brow public. And the manner, as much as the content, of Ruskin's attacks on political economy offended the susceptibilities of this public, so much so that the editor had, with great expressions of regret, of course, to tell Ruskin that the appearance of the 4th article in the series would have to be the last, and the series would have to be suspended because too many readers had protested. Now, you could read this, of course, as one kind of success, although in practical terms you'd have to say it's also clearly one form of failure. Ruskin lost the chance to address that public, and the form of his criticism could, to that extent, be seen as self-defeating. Taking a longer view, of course, we also have to remember that writing reaches publics other than that which it is aimed at initially, and in fact in book form, as again many of you will know, Unto This Last went on to be one of the sacred texts of social reformers and radicals of the subsequent generation or two. It was the most widely quoted source of inspiration for the first intake of MPs of the new Labour Party at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was famously cited by Gandhi as a book which made him transform his life. So the question of what counts as success in this sense is not straightforward. Let me equally briefly take another equally well-known example. Just consider for a second Matthew Arnold's use of the weapons of wit and charm to criticize what he'd called the bad civilization of the English middle class, and his constant falling back, where positive characterizations are at stake, on what can seem like irritating catchphrases or formulae, phrases like our best self and sweetness and light, and so on. And Arnold's playfulness, what he called my vivacities, always ran the risk of being counterproductive. Many readers then and now, I think, have bridled at what they see as his flippant and perhaps condescending tone in these vivacities. And it's not, after all, an unambiguous sign of success to be termed, as he was at the time, Mr. Kid Glove Cocksure. But Arnold knew what risks he was taking. Everything turns, he wrote in a letter in 1864, upon one's exercising the power of persuasion, of charm. I'm convinced only by a literary form of this kind being given to them can ideas such as mine ever gain any access in a country such as ours. Well, the responses to Arnold in the general cultural periodicals of the time certainly demonstrate that he gained some kind of access, and of course Culture and Anarchy in its book form has been drawn on by individuals in many generations ever since. But here too there is a question about what quite counts as success and how far these various gnomic or catchphrases contributed to it. Now, nobody here, certainly not either of my expert Victorian discussants, would, I think, take the Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli as a wide-eyed idealist. But think about his testimony. He met Arnold some 12 years after the publication of Culture and Anarchy, and Disraeli praised the way that Arnold had established the currency of these various phrases, such as sweetness and light. And when it was objected that perhaps this was a drawback, because, as Arnold later reported it, people got hold of my phrases and then thought they knew all about my work, Disraeli answered, never mind, it's a great achievement, it's a great achievement. So quite what kind of achievement that is, I think, one of the interesting questions. Now, from one perspective, the repetitiveness signalled in these examples, and many others you might take, I think could be unsettling. If the case against reductive instrumentalism has been so well made by classic writers in one generation, why does it need to be restated, often in very similar terms, in subsequent generations? And yet, given our deeply historicized sensibilities, we clearly can't accept that either their targets or their criteria for criticism are in any way timeless or universal. And we, and especially I think those of us who are academics in humanities disciplines, you notice the Trilling-esque we, which I have to slip in occasionally here, that we are prone to feel that the cluster of intellectual developments we label theory have, since the 1970s and 1980s, decisively changed the terms of cultural criticism, have perhaps even rendered that category unusable unless we first emphatically mark the discontinuities with the tradition that I've taken examples from. Any unanalyzed use of the first person plural, any apparent assumption about universality, any attempt to speak from a subject position not circumscribed in terms of class, gender, race, and so on, any unproblematized appeal to language or literature, any suggestion that criticism might be a transparent or objective activity, perhaps even any notion of activity. All of these things have been, of course, quite properly questioned, with the result that we may now even regard with some suspicion, perhaps even some hostility, any suggestion that the examples that I'm pointing to here can in any way speak to us now, whoever we might be now. Well, as I say, I'm not proposing any simple claim to celebrate or indeed to repeat the achievements of these figures, and I don't think they constitute exactly a prescription. As I've already begun to suggest, what interests me in part here is the way that what, from many points of view, might be thought of as their failure could also be read in certain other ways as a kind of success or at least bumping up against the limits of the task to get as near to success as is possible. But surely, he said adverbially, surely they do help us think about some still relevant questions about the constraints of public debate and the literary or rhetorical resources needed to overcome or circumvent them. We're not, after all, here talking about elaborate philosophical treatises or even extended works of literary criticism. These writings are, in every sense, more occasional and more opportunist than that. Yet they also deliberately keep their distance from the nuts and bolts language of policy and administration. And that is what I think sometimes generates a sense of incongruity or even frustration. We might, after all, refer with enthusiastic assent to some of Cardinal Newman's wonderful prose cadendas about universities and so on, but we'd be very surprised if they figured in our university's half-yearly annual budget report or something like that. And we'd be surely very nervous of some Treasury Secretary who had been reading Ruskin and who announced to Wall Street that there is no wealth but life. So we are in some ways interested in the space between these discourses, and yet at the same time I suspect we are not quite willing to relegate them to some self-contained arena where they have no relation to the business of life, where the business of life is left to certain self-described hard-headed realists, and where criticism is a self-fulfilling activity intended only to be read by others who like that kind of self-fulfilling activity. Now, here I think it is helpful to think about the forms of expression of such criticism, as well as what, always unsteady distinction we might call its content. And I find it helpful here to draw on one of the books that in the last decade or so has been one of the most widely admired contributions to theoretical debate, Amanda Anderson's 2006 book, The Way We Argue Now. Now, I'm not going to attempt to summarize Anderson's very impressive reformulation of what is a broadly Habermasian ideal of a practice of reasoned argument governed by, as she puts it at one point, the constant attempt to break free of the horizons of one's ethical life. Anderson is, as some of you expect will know, and she makes very clear, principally concerned with contemporary academic debate, but she does also manifest a desire to promote forms of reasoning which will, as she puts it, have a positive effect on fostering public sphere argument. So her case is, I think, on the whole, an admirable one in principle, but it seems to me that it is rather like Habermas himself before her, one that pays practically no attention to the different literary forms and tactics that may be called for by public debate, by contrast to philosophical argument. It's true that her notion of argument as ethos, like Habermas's ideal speech situation, is a regulative ideal, and she recognizes, of course, that empirically various non-rational elements do come into play in shaping people's responses. But even though her emphasis on ethos is intended to turn aside the reproach that this appeal to universal criteria can be thinly rationalistic, this still functions, it seems to me, at the level of what we might call the ethical or affective content of the argument. What's left unaddressed here, I think, is the thinly rationalistic mode of argument. And as one moves out of the academic and into the public sphere, this becomes at least a very central feature. Her approach might then become, as it were, discursively thin, not just rationalistically thin. Now, where ethical content is concerned, Anderson recommends what she, with perhaps uncharacteristic playfulness on her part, calls thickifying the thin. But is there a sense in which we need to do something similar where the mode of argument in public debate is concerned as well? I suppose the starkest, most abstract model of what we refer to rather casually as public debate is one where members of the relevant public used to think X, but then, as a result of reading or hearing a well-reasoned case, they come to see the error of their ways and think Y. But actually, in this bare form, this is surely a very rare and anyway a very inadequate description of what any elaborated or deep-seated beliefs are likely to encounter in public debate. It is, as I say, too thinly rationalistic. And it seems to not just disregard all those now very familiar sociological determinants of subject position and worldview and so on, been the centre of attention in political and cultural theory for several decades now, but it makes no allowance, I think, for the myriad ways in which, at that level of public discussion, various other non-rational elements help to determine or modify our attentiveness or our receptiveness at a more individual level. And more interestingly, perhaps, the thinly rationalistic mode assumes that the language, in the fullest sense, of existing beliefs and the language of the criticism are straightforwardly commensurable. That the process of criticism involves recommending proposition B as a replacement, as it were, for proposition A, and that this substitution can then be clearly effected without any strain on the surrounding framework of belief. Now, this, I suppose, may occasionally happen in certain restricted circumstances, especially with beliefs of a rather empirical or technical kind, but in anything more ambitious, and of course any social or cultural criticism deserving the name is likely to be more ambitious, anything more ambitious will involve some kind of clash of descriptions. If the languages involved are not, in purely technical or philosophical terms, strictly incommensurable, even so the discrepancies in descriptions are likely to be so profound and so extensive that the need to be accounted for in terms other than those of the thinly rationalistic model of debate starts to be very pressing. Now, if we bring this thought back to the model, to the question of what counts as success in such an enterprise, I think it may help us to see that we need to think in terms, of course, of a plurality of operations, including getting attention for something or disconcerting the adherents of the conventional wisdom and so on. But it also makes clear that to achieve those kinds of effects, the critic will need to take certain risks. And wherever a writer departs from the prevailing mores or norms of public discussion, whether by being deliberately provocative or by seeming to be hopelessly idealistic or by self-consciously being a little too charming or using other weapons of satire or humour, anything in a way that disturbs the discursive equilibrium, risks being self-defeating because various readers and auditors will say that this is not now a positive or constructive or practical contribution to the debate at hand. But my question is, what if the critic believes that the categories and assumptions involved in any contribution to the debate at hand that could be labelled constructive or practical are exactly the assumptions that need to be challenged? And what if, further, the critic is right to think that he or she will never succeed in gaining attention for any alternative framework, still less any assent to it, except by infringing the conventional decorum of discussion in some way? Now, it may be that within the academic world of the early 21st century, I don't know, you could tell me whether even especially perhaps in the American version of that world, tactics of this sort are particularly prone to make us uncomfortable. In a contribution to a 2004 volume of essays on polemic, published under the auspices of the English Institute, Jonathan Crew observed that in recent decades, demands for civility, professional respect, negotiation, and collective endeavour have almost banished forceful polemic of this kind from our public and academic life. The academic warrior critic bent on annihilation, he writes, now seems embarrassingly old-fashioned, pathological, or simply out of place. And Crew obviously believes that such literary tactics now have no hope of succeeding, though I do, when I read that, just wonder whether the mention of embarrassment may not be two-edged. Such unease, after all, registers one response to the breach of decorum, but it may, perhaps, also register a form of disruption which can be turned in a fruitful direction. That is, I think, the general case I want to put before you. The only way really to make this kind of case stand up is by looking at an individual example in some detail. There's never enough time in a shortened version of a lecture to do that, but for the rest of this lecture, I am going to take one example and try and say a little more about what I think is going on in this kind of writing. And to make it a little harder for myself, I'm going to take what I suppose most people would regard in advance as one of the least promising examples. One of those where the critic's transgressions and evasions were thought to be not just ineffectual, but actually self-defeating. There can be no two opinions about the tone in which Dr. Leavis deals with Sir Charles. It is a bad tone, an impermissible tone. That judgment, as perhaps some of you know, is Lionel Trilling's. You can hear the habitual leaning towards the magisterial already, but it expressed a much more widely shared opinion, both at the time and since. F.R. Leavis's critique in his 1962 Richmond lecture of C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution was, and I suppose has remained, a byword for excess. Too personal, too dismissive, too rude, too Leavis. And whatever view they've taken of the limitations and confusions of Snow's original contentions, and Trilling, to be fair, has among others itemized several of those, commentators on this celebrated or notorious exchange — it can't really be called an exchange, there was little give and even less take — commentators have largely concurred in finding the style and address of Leavis's scathing criticism to be self-defeating. At the time, Aldous Huxley denounced it as violent and ill-mannered, disfigured by its one-track moralistic literarism. And even those reviewers who were sympathetic to some of Leavis's criticism recoiled. Here, wrote one, is pure hysteria. Now, Trilling, of course, as he so often did, cast himself as the grave and head-shaking judge of this courtroom brawl. And he states his case with his characteristic air of pained obligation. He's sorry to have to report that, for all their merits, neither Snow nor Leavis quite comes up to the mark that is set by mind at its most strenuous yet flexible best. But he's particularly severe on Leavis. For Trilling, in an interesting phrase that I'll pick up in another way in a moment, for Trilling, Leavis's anger, scorn, and excessive consciousness of persons stand in the way of what he meant to say. So, as a result of this excess and the vehemence of the response that he had provoked, all question about science or literature or education, Trilling observed, have now been made merely subordinate elements in what amounts to a scandal over a breach of manners. But I wonder whether even Trilling, entering the debate with this self-conscious gravitas of his, even he quite does justice to the execution of Leavis's intention in this debate. I suppose raising that question at Columbia, of all places, might be a breach of manners as well, of another kind. But let me raise it, nonetheless. The attack on Snow, it will be a classic, was Leavis's very surprising, I think, and very confident judgment on his lecture. Well, not many readers have concurred with that judgment. It's more commonly seen as a classic example, as I said, of intemperate abuse. But I do think with the passage of time, the merits of its criticisms of Snow and of what Snow represented have started to become more apparent. In particular, the character of Leavis's performance and the genre to which it belongs have come into far more clear focus as the contingent elements of personality and newsworthiness have fallen away. And so half a century or so after its initial delivery, it seems to me a good time really to consider whether Leavis's lecture should be seen as a piece of intemperate and self-defeating abuse, or whether it wasn't actually aspiring to be a minor classic of cultural criticism. And it's still, perhaps, a pertinent illustration, both of the obstacles faced by somebody who feels himself confronted by a set of dominant attitudes that are so widely shared and so deeply rooted as to seem to most members of that society to be self-evident. It's also, I think, an interesting example of the discursive tactics or rhetorical resources which the critic may feel in those circumstances he or she has to resort to get attention for an alternative case. Now, as I said, much of the immediate response to Leavis's critique thought that it was unpardonably personal in its attack on Snow. But Leavis always made clear that he did not think that it was a personal question at all. He had in his sights a target much larger than the failings of a particular individual. And although the episode is usually referred to as the two cultures controversy, Leavis also insisted, and I think not altogether wrongly, that he was not primarily offering a commentary on the disciplinary character and claims of the humanities as opposed to the sciences, or even less offering a particular prescription for educational or institutional priority of one over the other. And most certainly, he was not denying the huge importance of science in the modern world. His real target, as he made clear, I think, was neither a particular individual nor a set of educational arrangements. It was, in the first instance, the dynamics of reputation and public debate, the ways in which certain figures are consecrated as bearers of cultural authority. But beyond that, it was centrally the axiomatic status accorded to economic prosperity as the exclusive or overriding goal of all social action and policy that he was taking issue with. Well, obviously, that's not something that's gone away, so I think there is still a little merit to be got from rereading Leavis's lecture with those things in mind. I'm not sure how many people here will at some point have read it, but let me give you again its first sentence. It's, shall we mildly say, an unusual way to begin a public lecture about another figure. If confidence in oneself as a mastermind, qualified by capacity, insight, and knowledge to pronounce authoritatively on the frightening problems of our time is genius, then there can be no doubt about Sir Charles Snow's. He goes on in much the same vein. As you see, even from that sentence, the language is very carefully chosen, and the high register, genius, mastermind, and so on, start to suggest a certain ironizing of this claim. And of course, what he goes on to make clear, but it is in fact, I think, packed into that opening sentence, is that it's really only because of Snow's overwhelming self-confidence about his right to talk about these matters that he has been accorded the status to do so. The rest of the first paragraph, in fact, enforces this judgment in the following way. Of course, anyone who offers to speak with inwardness and authority on both science and literature will be conscious of more than ordinary powers in himself. And of course, we then know that Snow is being held guilty of being a little too conscious of his little too ordinary powers. But what he's focusing on here from the start is the tone of Snow's pronouncements. And this is where we got one of the most withering sentences in what's, as you're beginning to hear, I'm sure, a pretty withering performance overall. Leavis again. The peculiar quality of Snow's assurance expresses itself in a pervasive tone, a tone of which one can say that while only genius could justify it, one cannot readily think of genius adopting it. And there, I think, we might feel we have Snow. That is the tone, the self-assurance, which is what is really most in Leavis's sights. Now, as Leavis goes on with his indictment, he makes an observation in passing, which I think has a significance for this activity that I'm trying here to use him as a particular illustration of. Leavis allows that in the matters under discussion, as he puts it, thought doesn't always admit of control by strict definition of the key terms. And he goes on, but the more fully one realizes this, the more aware will one be of the need to cultivate a vigilant responsibility in using these terms, and an alert consciousness of any changes of force they may incur as the argument passes from context to context. Now that may seem like a piece of common sense or just a basic maxim of critical hygiene, really, But I think for Leavis, this signals a very important tactical principle. Even though one's opponents may demand that one's position be given crisp and definitive formulation, stipulative definition of abstract terms, he's saying, is going to be of very little value in these contexts. Indeed, it may even get in the way of provoking deeper thinking. And instead, the cultural critic cultivates, and by example and even by irritating obstructiveness, incites others to cultivate a restless dissatisfaction with abstract terms, a mindful awareness of the reductive or Procrustean potential of all general formulations. And that, he's suggesting, is the home territory of the literary critic, and I think points to a particular role in public debate which Leavis thought was available to him, something that required more than ordinary attentiveness to the way language functions, and something which is not a mere distracting fastidiousness, but an active embodiment of positive values in itself in the course of controversy. In contrast, which is part of this engagement that Leavis makes this point, he describes Snow's language in the original lecture as a document for the study of cliché. Well, cliché, of course, results from repetition, and a proposition that is repeated frequently and generally enough recognizes itself or acquires the status of the self-evident. And Leavis is suggesting that Snow is a portent or signal. That is to say, he merits examination precisely because he's so unoriginal. He suggests that Snow is a portent and that his platitudes resonate with a wider audience precisely because he is saying what they already find to be partially self-evident. And these are what Leavis denounces as the currency values, that verbal coin that is almost rubbed smooth by constantly being circulated in a particular social world. I think there's always a danger when the critic, of course, presents himself as in some way outside this social world, and Leavis very frequently, as some of you will know, does go in for the self-dramatizing, that he is such an outsider that it's in fact impossible to obtain a hearing for any alternative perspective. But of course, apart from anything else that he claims to the actual historical uptake that his lecture obtained, we'd have to say, just as textual readers, that it is itself assuming, by making that point, that it can reach an audience capable of recognizing that point, capable of recognizing the truth of the critique. And so the power of cliché, even if great, is not total, and the system can't be entirely closed. Now, the particular piece of Snow's hackneyed wisdom on which Leavis fastens at this point is the assertion that members of the scientific culture have the future in their bones, together with its comparison to the members of the traditional culture as natural Luddites. And Leavis's preferred strategy at this point, and he resorts to it in a lot of his cultural criticism, those of you who've read others of his will know, his preferred strategy is to suggest that although no adequate characterization of the goals of human life can be given, except by descending into vacuous abstraction, great novels can embody such values in some way. They ask the question that provides the title for my lecture tonight: what for? What ultimately for? What ultimately do men live by, in his phrase? And Leavis rules, preemptively, of course, to such questions there can't be, in any ordinary sense of the word, answers. So in their place, and as a kind of shorthand description of some more adequate description of values of human life, Leavis points to the work of some of his most cherished novelists, above all Joseph Conrad and inevitably D.H. Lawrence. And in practice, I think he does little more really than name these writers. He doesn't go in for, at this point, any detailed exposition or any kind of literary criticism which tries to show how these values are embodied here. Now, that may be the occasion didn't allow, but I have to say myself that I think Leavis's criticism often has this characteristic, that is to say that he appeals to a judgment which in some sense seems to be already made, in fact so made that it in turn should function for the reader as self-evident, and the work of criticism is always assumed somehow to have been done in the past. Of course, whether all literary criticism does something a little like that, appeals to a recognition that it has to be there, is an interesting question we might come back to. Now, not many people at the time thought that Leavis's lecture was, as one of his admirers described it, one of the greatest rhetorical performances I have ever read for mounting splendour of scornful irony. But I think even those who did admire it would have to recognise that he falls away from whatever high standard he's established in the opening of this lecture in its final few pages. But in those few pages, more opinionated, more prejudiced perhaps, there are a couple of phrases which I just want to pick up on. And one is about having invoked the importance of studying English at university. Having invoked that, he goes on to say, I won't say more now about what I mean by this, but I will only say that the academic, I think he means here the academic category or style, not the individual person, the academic is the enemy, and that the academic can be beaten, as we who ran Scrutiny for 20 years, the journal Leavis mainly edited, we proved. And in expressing his hope that a Cambridge animated by such a centre of consciousness might become a place where the culture of the Sunday papers was not taken to represent the best that is thought and known in our time, and where, as a consequence, Snow would not be taken so seriously, not paid this deferential attention. Where that is the case, Leavis emphasises that what's at fault is the journalistic addiction of our academic intellectuals, adding, and journalism, in one form or another, is now the menacing disease of university English. The reason I pick this out is it does look at first sight like a rather puzzling, maybe self-contradictory pair of points to make. That is to say, he is denouncing both the academic mode and the journalistic mode. And these are perhaps often taken as two poles, maybe even two divergent camps, which between them define the opportunities, the career patterns, and the voices that can be used in public debate. How is it that Leavis can seem to be denouncing both of these? What alternative place does this leave him to stand? And I think this is where we get very close to the identifying the character of this infamous attack on Snow. Leavis believes that there is potentially, at least, a form of participation in public debate that is not in thrall to either of these dominant modes. This is what he means by the critical function. It draws upon one's human and intellectual resources. It engages with the facet of reality under examination, and it seeks to make this engagement vividly present to a wider readership. So he's saying it will avoid the vices of academicism, sham impersonality, exaggerated deference to authorities, the avoidance of judgment, not of course that we would recognize any of those as features of academicism in our time, but it also avoids the pitfalls characteristic of journalism, as he sees it: superficiality, sensationalism, attention-seeking, the overvaluing of what is merely topical or current. So such criticism, that is neither of those things, will be outspoken, but will also be properly grounded. It will, inevitably, involve disputing the received wisdom and disparaging fashionable expectations. It will attempt to maintain the highest intellectual standards, but it will not withdraw from public debate. It will engage in it. And that is what he offers his lecture as an example of. The last thing I want to draw out from this lecture is another aspect of the way Leavis engages with contemporary language. He picks out at one point from a leading article in the Guardian newspaper a phrase which he recognises might be seen to concede much of what Leavis wants to say. The phrase, science is a means only to an end. But what's interesting, I think, is how Leavis himself responds to this. This doesn't, for him, involve the real recognition, the real slow coming to see of what is at stake here. What this offers, he suggests, is another truism. And it lacks, and this is the phrase I want to focus on, it lacks, he says, the friction, the sense of pregnant arrest, which goes with active realizing thought and the taking of a real charged meaning. Now, that may sound, to some of us who've read a lot of Leavis, to be suggesting that we all have to write rather like Leavis and that qualification-packed prose of his. But I think what he's suggesting is we don't do best to combat one reductive truism by proposing a different reductive truism in its place. We don't do better by simply increasing the circulation of cliché. We need that friction, that sense of pregnant arrest in the reading experience, because that is part of the alternative that is being proposed. And here again moves to his hallmark meta-commentary, and as I've suggested, this tradition so often does. He says, this is not a simple answer, no serious answer could be. So by constantly drawing attention to the second-order questions about the status of any attempt at first-order statement, I think Leavis is deliberately calling attention to the difficulties of this task and the deceptions of anyone who attempts to answer these questions in simple terms. This isn't some kind of methodological preliminary, this is Leavis's reply. Well, as I said at the beginning, not many readers then, or perhaps now, would say that Leavis was wholly successful in doing this. He may seem exactly the kind of figure Jonathan Crew, I quoted earlier, had in mind when he referred to the academic warrior critic bent on annihilation. But while the tactics may occasionally have misfired, for sure, what I just want to end with is a thought about the strategy that Leavis chose to adopt here. The first thing I think would be to ask how one finds both a platform and a mode of expression such that views which are critical of very deeply and widely shared assumptions will get any kind of hearing. Now, Leavis, as I've said, I think over-dramatized his exclusion. In the latter part of his career, at any rate, he didn't have much difficulty in placing an article in one of the mainstream periodicals when he chose to do so, although he rather rarely did. Still, just imagine, for the moment, a little counterfactual imagining, just imagine that Leavis had brought out a carefully detailed analysis of Snow's fiction in a strictly scholarly journal, the Review of English Studies or whatever. Or just imagine that he'd published a brief but very well-informed disagreement with Snow's educational views in the Times Educational Supplement. Now, some readers may feel those would have been more constructive, more helpful contributions. But there's no doubt they would have received far less attention, and, more importantly, the cautious statement of limited disagreements with Snow would, far from calling his standing as a sage into question, have indirectly reinforced that standing. And in such cases, it's the whole mechanism by which celebrity is transmuted into authority that Leavis thought needs to be exposed. And it's hard to see how this case can be done without giving offence to those who have themselves colluded with or even been the beneficiaries of that process. And if it's not just this or that particular view that the critic feels impelled to criticise, but the poverty of mind that finds expression in such inadequate views, then it's hard to see how any mode is going to be as telling as the kind of stringent literary criticism that Leavis suggested that we need. As I hinted earlier, simply holding up a sample of the objectionable prose and the tweezers of quotation can sometimes be one of the most deadly ways to call attention to the crippling or embarrassing inadequacy of the views in question. These critical tactics, of course, always risk seeming condescending or sneering, but perhaps, as I was saying in relation to Arnold, that may be a risk the cultural critic often has to take if the systemic limitations of the perspective under examination are to be properly expressed. I will just say in passing also that, as so often, one incidental effect of Leavis's attack was to give voice to views which others held in maybe more embryonic form or in circumstances where they didn't feel emboldened to speak out in this way. And that is, surely again, to return to it, one of the forms of success that cultural criticism can sometimes achieve. That is to say, it can help redirect attention, it can help give voice to, it can help discredit certain dominant characterizations for people who already perhaps feel some inclination to take those positions but are constrained in various other ways. Still, there is a form of offensiveness at work in doing this, and offensiveness of this kind is not soon forgiven. Well, I want to conclude, as you can see, by suggesting that there is something we might learn from this process of infiltrating a certain other perspective through often an outrageous, certainly a critical, and usually a highly charged and rather complex form of prose which seeks to replace the simplicities of the dominant view with something more adequate. But this process of criticism may be the success to aim at. May be, for this, what the critic needs is, by analogy with the so-called slow food movement, some idea of slow criticism, some way in which, by its indirection and arrest, the criticism causes readers to become a little less confident in rehearsing their standard truisms, a little more likely to stumble into some reflective or provocative thinking. Obviously, this doesn't entirely liberate the critic from the discursively awkward position of appearing to speak on behalf of the ineffable, but by drawing attention to the critical engagement itself, I think it starts the insidious process by which a prevailing discourse does come to seem more shallow or more misleading or in some other way inadequate. Of course, from one point of view, Leavis might not seem an obvious recruit to any putative slow criticism movement. As he himself wryly notes, one Italian periodical described him as puritano frenetico, and that intense, combative address of his printed voice doesn't, I know, at first conjure up the process by which the patient accretion of alternative descriptions, almost geological in the pace of its operations, modifies existing sensibilities. Anger, after all, operates at a faster tempo, and the Richmond lecture is a deeply angry performance. But I think closer familiarity with his much-remarked syntax suggests that it can be seen as precisely a straining against the limits of sequential exposition in the interests of recognizing the simultaneity and interrelatedness of considerations that are flattened by others into blandly self-contained propositions, which in turn congeal into cliché. To be disturbed into an awareness, however uneasy or resistant, of this process may be to start to register the power of his critical voice. So in those terms, I want to suggest to you that although Leavis's lecture, for all its flaws, may not quite be thought to be a minor classic of cultural criticism, it perhaps has a claim on our attention, not least as a way of provoking us to think about how we might engage in similar tasks. Thank you.
I yield to no one in my admiration for Stefan Collini's work. He is one of our most prolific and respected intellectual historians, with interest ranging from 19th century political economy to the history of the disciplines to the future of the universities. He's one of the very few living academics who genuinely deserves the title public intellectual, for his careful and judicious essays in the TLS and the London Review of Books provide a bridge that connects the academic audience to the group of so-called general educated readers. His prose is accessible but exacting. His ideas are complex yet comprehensible. His ardor is contagious. His commitment to the humanities knows no equal. He refuses to fall back on empty platitudes. He does not traffic in cliches about the ability of the humanities to make students more human or to make them better citizens. Stefan is tough-minded and level-headed. He is uncompromising in his intellectual grasp of difficult subjects. He asks a lot of his readers, not because his style is challenging, but because his ideas refuse simplification. But he gives readers more than he asks of them. He gives new perspectives on what seem like old ideas. He makes received ideas seem new. He makes them new, because when he reformulates them, the ideas have been newly processed, digested, and given new life. All the more reason why I am so baffled by Stefan's lecture tonight. I think I get the main points. He argues that cultural criticism, as a critique of the reductive instrumentalism of the dominant discourse, always seems to fall short of its aspirations. Indeed, unable to break out of or into the dominant discourse, cultural criticism dwindles to a series of cliches that ring false, fall flat, sound hollow. Asking how to measure the success of criticism that attacks the very ground of its target's intelligibility, Stefan proposes that the perceived lack of success of such critique may be the only kind of success to which cultural criticism can aspire. Shifting gears, he then says that a critic's language can be the, quote, active embodiment of positive values, that the only way such values can be made effective is in controversy, end quote. Taking F.R. Leavis's 1962 engagement with CP Snow as his test case, Stefan concludes that Leavis's razor-edged barbs constitute a genuine and somehow constructive alternative to the kind of brisk, explicit statement that so few are actually able to hear. Calling for a mode of slow criticism that consists of, quote, the patient accretion of alternative descriptions, almost geological in the pace of its operation, end quote. Stefan insists that this kind of dismantling can alter the sensibilities of readers too numbed by the dominant discourse to hear what is said more clearly. I'm afraid that I'm not convinced. Is it really the case that the only alternatives for those of us who feel that the dominant discourse does not speak our language are either to utter the most banal cliches or to launch a full-out assault? Is it really the case that close reading and the almost automatic invocation of canonical touchstones like Ruskin, Arnold, Leavis, and Trilling are the best ways to get an audience's attention in 2013? As I've read and reread Stefan's lecture, I've worked through a number of explanations for my confusion. Maybe I'm just not getting it, I've thought. Maybe what Stefan has offered us is really a parody of the efforts offered by the two contemporary critics he cites, Amanda Anderson and Jonathan Crew. Maybe, in other words, he is imitating what these critics do in order to demonstrate why their writing is so self-involved and tedious. Or maybe Stefan is offering us some kind of Homi Bhabha-type mimicry in which Stefan generates a close reading that we're supposed to recognize as simultaneously overdone and overwrought of a text that probably almost no one in this room has read in order to occupy such readings and turn them into something more consequential. Or maybe Stefan's endorsement of a criticism of invective, coming as it does from such a gentle and gallant scholar, is somehow a form of autocritique, so refined and elusive that even Nabokov would pause to admire. The more I've tried to figure this out, the more confused I've become. I've finally decided that the issue behind the issue, what may really be animating both Stefan's choice of topic and the approach he's taken, is not simply the tendency of reductive instrumentalism to swallow up all attempts to speak in other terms, but the attack upon the humanities that now animates so many discussions of higher education. As Stefan knows, as so many of us know, the humanities have come under attack for not adding measurable value to students' educational experiences. Here, the emphasis often falls on measurable. For one prong of the complaint is that the kind of value courses in the humanities do add does not easily yield to quantification. The accreditors for the state of New York recently demanded, for example, that the NYU English department provide quantifiable measures for the categories upon which we assess our PhD candidates' readiness to proceed to the dissertation. If the members of the student's thesis committee determine that the student has passed the qualifying examinations, in other words, what numerical values do we assign to the criteria upon which we base our judgment? When the director of graduate studies asked me how I would answer this question, I drew a blank. How can one assign a number value to one's judgment, or to the adequacy of a student's knowledge of the canonical works of 19th century literature, or to the student's ability to craft the kind of finely tuned sentences that Stefan Collini so effortlessly turns out? In humanities disciplines like English literature, which do not evaluate students with tests whose answers can be graded as right or wrong, how does the dominant language of qualification even apply? If such efforts to quantify judgment are not examples of the reductive instrumentalism of the dominant discourse, drowning out an alternative, I don't know what is. Thus, I wonder if Stefan's reference to F.R. Leavis's apparent indifference to the content of C.P. Snow's Two Cultures essay, Leavis's claim that he was not interested in the claims of the humanities as opposed to those of the sciences, isn't an oblique acknowledgement that this is precisely what both men are interested in. How can a spokesperson for the humanities defend what we do in the face of demands that we accede to the evaluative criteria and procedures by which scientists measure their own and their students' success? When Stefan says that the cultural critic's lack of success in conventional terms is, quote, the only kind of success to which cultural criticism can aspire, end quote, is he also saying that if the humanities were to succeed in the terms dictated by the sciences, they would actually fail to maintain a set of accomplishments, the achievement of which cannot be measured or quantified? If this is Stefan's real target, then I'm with him. But I still worry about the way he only gestures toward the alternative offered by humanities disciplines. Twice he refers to what he calls the home turf of the literary critic, or the literary critic's home territory. First, he says that this home turf is tone, the analysis as well as the cultivation of tone. Then he says that the home territory of the literary critics is a dissatisfaction with abstract terms and general formulations. In both instances, I infer the home base of literary critics, the place we feel safe and also ahead of the game, is language. As Stefan so eloquently phrases it, quote, attentiveness to language functions as the active embodiment of positive values and the only way such values can be effective in controversy, end quote. Now, the position Stefan adumbrates here seems to me to be the beginning of an endorsement of an alternative to the dominant discourse, especially insofar as that discourse is wedded to evaluation by quantifiable criteria. Yet he does not really develop or defend this alternative. Instead, Stefan offers the close reading of Leavis's attack on Snow, that is, I assume, intended to enact the alternative rather than describe it. This is, I suppose, his point, articulating the alternative to the dominant discourse as a brisk, explicit statement, risk the very reduction he is trying to critique. Thus, Stefan offers no brisk, explicit statement at all, only the close reading whose, quote, sardonic, skeptical, sharp-edged tone, end quote, he interprets as a fruitful disruption of Snow's complacent sense of disciplinary superiority. If Stefan's target in these remarks is at least partly the bureaucratic demand that the humanities disciplines produce some kind of product whose value can be quantified, then I don't think it is enough to, quote, draw attention to the critical engagement itself, end quote, as a response to that demand. In the first place, it seems to me that the humanities disciplines have made themselves vulnerable to such demands by our collective failure to articulate the terms in which what we do should be considered valuable, the terms in which we should be evaluated. It isn't enough simply to insist, as many of us have done, that whatever humanities add to our students' educational experience should not be evaluated at all. In a period of fiscal constraint, when budgeting decisions have to be made, evaluation is inevitably part of the administrative process, And to say that we don't want the humanities to be evaluated is like spitting into the wind. Then, too, I think that for at least the last 20 or 30 years, the humanities disciplines have so limited our sense of what we do to critique that we are virtually begging to be evaluated on our ability to destroy something we collectively don't like. What we collectively don't like has often been some version of the reductive instrumentalism of the dominant discourse that Stefan highlights. But the target of the humanities critique has just as often been some political or social injustice that has seemed to us to be unfair or illiberal. Racism, colonialism, sexism, prejudices against various minorities, the failure to take seriously the fate of the planet, wealth inequality, capitalism. Don't get me wrong, all of these targets deserve critique. And as a political person, I fight against them using all of the weapons at my disposal. But I have increasingly worried that in arguing that what humanists do in our classrooms is pass along this critique to our students, we have lost our disciplinary way. The problem is not simply, as Stefan implies, that this kind of critique falls on deaf ears of those who speak the dominant discourse. The problem is that by reducing the practice of the humanities to critique, by making this the primary thing we imagine ourselves to be paid for doing, we fail to develop or articulate a forceful description of our positive contributions to our students' education, what we add beyond the ability to criticize or find fault. Earlier this term, I had the rather unsettling experience of visiting a graduate program in a university I won't name, and in the course of trying to discuss their work with a group of English graduate students, I found every single student eager to tell me about how she was sharpening the ability of her students to develop critique instead of being able to say what her own dissertation was about. When I pressed them, when I asked directly, "But what are you writing about?" one young woman answered, "Don't you see, that's why it's so great to go into literature. It doesn't matter what you write about or what's on the syllabus. Once you're in the classroom, you can really help shape the way your students see the world, the way they understand inequality." Now, I admire that student's passion and her candor, but the exchange left me thinking that if the studies of the humanities have been distilled into critique, then it's no wonder that we have no affirmative account of the value we add to our students' education, not to mention the value of the scholarship we produce. Most of the people I know in the humanities, and I include myself in this, do not know enough about the intricacies of foreign policy, the intractable challenges of making a state budget cover all of the expenditures it's mandated to support, or the inner workings of Wall Street trading to offer more than a knee-jerk, if heartfelt, objection to the way things are as somehow wrong. I applaud the heartfelt response, but I don't think that the humanities should offer critique as the heart of what we do, as individual scholars or as classroom teachers. If all we do is criticize, after all, then we are opening ourselves up to criticism in turn, including the criticism that all we do is complain about matters we know little about. You will think that I have strayed far from what Stefan has actually said tonight, and I plead guilty to that. And yet I do think that the title this lecture saddled him with, the Lionel Trilling Seminar, as well as the subtitle he chose, The Limits of Cultural Criticism, point in the direction I've taken. The cultural criticism of Lionel Trilling's day has become the PC critique of our own. And yet the social and institutional conditions in which humanists work have so dramatically changed that the institutional prestige Trilling could count on to give weight to his cultural criticism no longer underwrites our shrill and repetitive critiques. The humanities have squandered the cultural capital they once built up as educational institutions and the economic the humanities have squandered the cultural capital they once built up as educational institutions, and the economic climate have changed. And with more undergraduates nationwide majoring in economics and biology than in English literature, it's hard to see how we're going to augment our disciplinary treasure unless we can describe in affirmative, positive terms the contributions that the humanities make to society today. Even though Stefan has shied away from such an affirmative assertion in this lecture, and remember his topic tonight was not what the humanities have to offer, but how an alternative to reductive instrumentalism can make itself heard, Even though he has not articulated a defense of the humanities tonight, he has done so elsewhere. I hope Stefan will forgive me for ending my remarks by quoting another of his lectures, which a certain mole leaked to me this week. As far as I know, this lecture is not yet in print, but it deserves publication and wide distribution, for it offers exactly the kind of thoughtful, impassioned assertion of the value of the humanities that I think we currently need. In that lecture, Stefan argues that the goal of research in the humanities is not to produce knowledge, but to cultivate understanding. And he also argues that such research should be evaluated by disciplined judgment, not quantifiable measures. In his words, quote, "The humanities are a series of disciplined attempts to extend and deepen understanding of the record of human activity in its richness and diversity across time and culture," end quote. Let me read that again. "The humanities are a series of disciplined attempts to extend and deepen understanding of the record of human activity in its richness and diversity across time and culture." In this focused assertion, there is no mention of cultural criticism, no reference to critique. Maybe these disciplined attempts are what Stefan means by slow criticism. But if this is so, I would much rather he make such brisk, explicit statements directly, rather than trying to enact them through a close reading that risks seeming as narrow as the humanities have allowed themselves to become. Thank you.
One of the many things that Stefan Collini is very good at is identifying patterns. He does so brilliantly in his book Absent Minds, where he shows how repetitive and self-deluding intellectuals tend to be when they disavow the fact that they are intellectuals. And he does so again in today's paper, where he exposes the rhetorical pattern by which cultural critics denounce the instrumentalism of the surrounding culture but fail to define what they set against this instrumentalism, taking refuge again in an taking refuge instead in an elevated and paradoxical evasiveness, for example, by appearing to speak on behalf of the ineffable. Stefan seems unable to avoid mocking this evasiveness, and bless him for it. But in this case, he doesn't actually want to mock it. Here, the point of isolating a pattern or a formula is to offer it a line of defense that it cannot articulate for itself. It's quite a challenge, but I think one that he meets triumphantly. The argument, as I understand it, is that the real force of the case against utility is not in its content, but in its tone. A tone that embodies a valuable approach to knowledge and a valuable way of being in the world, but, and this is a crucial but, that would betray its values if it managed to articulate them. If Stefan were not so caustic about theory, I would say the pattern of his own argument is deconstructive. I sometimes have my doubts about arguments of this deconstructive pattern, but I have to say that here the central insight seems to me right on target, at least as far as our teaching is concerned. To our students, I think that this is what's most likely to be understood and remembered as what we're teaching or what we have to say. I can't verify this, but my guess is long after they've forgotten the content of any one of our classroom interpretations, maybe even after they've forgotten what text we were interpreting, if they are left with anything at all, and there are days when I really wonder, they will be left with an impression of multiple choice where more than one answer can be right. Mary was just saying this. An experience of the quest for understanding, again, Mary was saying that, rather than an experience of arriving at a satisfactory conclusion. Let's say an experience of getting satisfaction from something that's less than conclusive. Like all questions about what lasts, and I think that may have been taken out of the paper as you delivered it. That was a great part of the paper we got that you didn't get. Try to get it from him. This is a chastening thought, but I think a necessary one. Conclusiveness is too much to ask for, so the argument goes, because For cultural criticism, everything is fair game, including the social world and including the critical tools that we're in the act of bringing to the social world. I think we can be grateful to Stefan for reminding us that criticism emerged out of, or rather in this expanded sense, as cultural rather than merely literary, and that much of what has happened in the era of multiculturalism belongs squarely in the tradition of Arnold, Leavis, and Trilling, whatever those worthies would have said about it. You can see that Mary and I are kind of not taking the same line on this. In effect, Stefan declares cultural criticism's rhetorical failure to be a kind of success. I think it is, in the sense that it continues to happen, continues to reproduce itself, continues to exert a certain fascination. And I appreciate enormously his stretching of the class of rhetorical effects that ought to count as success, like ridiculing respected authorities and thereby gaining attention for alternative frameworks and so on. On the other hand, and here I'm going to echo Mary again, there's something a bit contradictory about a case for scorn, ridicule, name-calling, and the put-down spoken in Stefan's characteristic tone of sweet reasonableness. You really should try this, you know, I mean, if you believe in it so much.
Just wait.
I've been waiting for a long time. I'm not sure that the medium and the message are on the same wavelength, so to speak. I'm also a bit unsure about the diagnosis that makes Leavis's ad hominem ranting, and if you haven't read this essay, have a go at it. It's really something that makes it seem like the proper medicine. Maybe this is an American point to make. Are we really suffering from a deficiency of righteous anger? Maybe the anger, not the righteousness, certainly not the self-righteousness or earnestness, let's say. We've got that down. Still, I think the basic point stands. As I understand it, that point is, if you are going to make it clear to everyone concerned that more is at stake in our work than career making, you may have to risk being a little righteous, a little angry, even a little over the top. Otherwise, you can have literary criticism, but you can't have cultural criticism. Which doesn't mean that speaking on behalf of the ineffable is the best we can do to make a case for ourselves. My own impulse, faced with the problem of not being able to specify what criticism or literature puts up against instrumentalism or instrumentality, utility, utilitarianism, whatever, is not to say vague nice words about criticism or literature, but to go back to instrumentalism or instrumentality, that term. It's instrumentalism that supposedly puts us on the spot, demands that we define ourselves, what we work on and what we do. But what do we mean by instrumental utilitarian? In asking this question, I'm inspired by Raymond Williams' old essay on base and superstructure. Some of you may remember it from the 1970s. When you were told that literature as superstructure is determined by its material base, Williams says, more or less, you should not deny the relationship between base and superstructure, as apologists for literature tend to do. You shouldn't declare that literature or culture is autonomous and wonderful in all sorts of more or less sublime and inexpressible ways. The stronger move is not to talk about the superstructure at all, but to talk about the base, specifically to dispute the other side's understanding of what the base is. You don't really have to say anything elevated about the superstructure at all. You just have to make it clear that while there is indeed determination going on, it's a simple mistake to think that the determining is being carried on by a base, imagined as, say, uniform or virtually as an object. What the base is, Williams says, is a set of different activities. This means that actors, like literature, like criticism, among many other actors, can help determine them as well as being determined by them. So the issue seems to me more or less the same thing with the instrumental. It ought not to be left to the other side to define what is and what is not instrumental. The word can mean very different things. Money-making is not the same thing as natural science, is not the same thing as bureaucratic quantification, and so on and so forth. we might well want to say that much of what we do is indeed instrumental, though instrumental to something different. For example, instrumental to democracy or to global citizenship. Not pushing one of those lines, I'm just trying to open up the question. Our kind of knowledge might be instrumental in more indirect ways than other kinds of knowledge. That doesn't mean it's of no use at all and should proudly declare its uselessness and or its ineffability. Another possibility would be to say, yes, we do indeterminacy. But that indeterminacy is a very useful thing to do. Assuming, say, and here I'm really talking about literature rather than the humanities in general, assuming, say, that literature is a vehicle for the preservation, the transmission, and the interpretation of experience, especially the experience of people distant from us in time and place. This is not an original thought. We could go on to say that such representations are very useful objects for a democratic polity to contemplate. Ideally, that they should be contemplated at least by all high school students and not just by English majors in universities. We could say it's a good and useful thing in a multicultural democracy and a multicultural world that people should see the experience of others represented to them. But if we took up this argument, we would also want to say, as an essential corollary of the proposition, something like what Stefan says about language and its ambiguity. When we confront representations of the experience of others, it is a good and necessary thing that we simultaneously pay attention to the limits and the ambiguities of our knowledge of others. Not because others are unknowable in some fundamental ontological sense, but simply because we owe it to them, as they owe it to us, to be attentive to the possibility and the arrogance of error on these matters, matters where one person's life experience tends to get projected onto another's, where absolute certitude ought not to be welcome, and where society has a clear and unambiguous interest in maintaining a certain ambiguity. So we're not talking here about something that's quantifiable, but we are, I think, talking about something that's very real. And we are, I think, not just talking about critique, but also about an affirmative achievement. It may be that I prefer this utilitarian or instrumental version of ambiguity over an anti-instrumentalist one, only because I personally am not a big asker of the what are the ends of life question. But I do also suspect that it's a more effective rhetorical move if and when we need a better line of defense for what we do. Thanks.
One perhaps that I can just say again that comes up in relation to both Bruce's and Mary's comments is that in this short paper, what I was trying to look at was what seemed to me to be some of the constraints of a particular sort of public controversy. Now, there are other kinds of thinking and writing that we all might want to do and sometimes do, which allow for various other registers and allow us to do various other things. But this is not about our academic self-defense, I think, here. This is more about when these sorts of critics are trying to, as I gave a thumbnail sketch at the very beginning, trying to, in some way, diagnose what they think are signs of cultural health or illness through reading particular symptoms. Now, that's a more specific activity, I think, than either, as it were, critique in general, and certainly than the whole enterprise of the humanities that we might be engaged in. So let me say first, I mean, I could certainly tell when Mary started, there were so many nice things at the beginning. There was obviously a huge but coming. And I'm going to let her bafflement stand, because I think this is a fruitful and productive kind of bafflement with what I was saying for the moment. But what I just want to say that I don't want to let stand is that I don't, in fact, intend this piece to be some indirect or covert way of making some case about the humanities. As Mary quoted very generously at the end, I've engaged with this in various other ways, and I think, make a case much more like the one that she eloquently made today, and which I would support. I think that kind of case has to be made much more about the whole range of things that we do, which is often actually empirical and specific and knotty and is about gains in understanding. And it would be a silly mistake, I think, to equate what we broadly call the humanities with critique. That would have a very narrowing effect, and I certainly don't do that. So we could talk more about the ways in which people have argued for or tried to defend the value of the humanities, but I have to say that wasn't my project in this paper. I was looking at something more specific. Now, just quickly, I think one of the things that both Bruce and Mary highlight is the apparently not just paradoxical but maybe self-defeating character of some claim which says this kind of critical language, this elaboration of certain critical points when engaging with the vocabulary of a particular discourse, is the only kind of success that this cultural criticism can aspire to. Now, I think I may be guilty of overstatement in putting only in there. That's what I was thinking about when I wrote it. We would all, I think, recognise, and especially if we are engaged in various forms of more obviously political action, that there are other, much more short-term or practical or limited kinds of success that putting certain counter-arguments, critiquing the positions of opponents might lead to. I'm not taking some either defeatist or conversely utopian view that we will change the world by being better critics of our opponents' prose. Not at all. But I do think that there is a difficulty, and why I pointed to the pattern, as Bruce said at the beginning, why I pointed to the pattern is there is a difficulty which seems to have recurred again and again in making the move from this form of critical performance, and I think performance is helpful here because it is something which is in that sense engaged and staged. It's not a merely withdrawn or as it were settled position. It is a performance of a position. I think there is a difficulty in making the move from that performance to some more general description of the values the performance is supposed to have in some way illustrated. And that it is that the difficulty of that transition, and the fact that that difficulty seems to be repeatedly encountered, is what really got me going in writing this paper. And as I said, I took Leavis's example in some ways because it seemed one of the most notorious cases, but precisely for that reason, therefore, perhaps, as is often the way with some of the more notorious or extreme cases, it even more starkly stands for some of this characteristic that I'm pointing to. And I still think, even in the light of polite criticism and some bafflement about this, I still think that that is a substantive aspect of this kind of cultural critical writing, which it is hard to approach in other ways. And that's really why I wanted to emphasize the point I made towards the end of the paper, that the critical engagement itself, I think, then becomes as near as we get to the statement of these more general propositions. As I say, there are lots of other things that over dinner I can get so much more invective and furious and so on that both would like to see me abandon some of my sweet reasonableness. I'll save that for later. I think lots of detail here that we can argue about. But I'm certainly very grateful to both of them because I do think they've taken it very seriously and pointed to this central set of questions, especially this set of questions about success and what is not, or how we might do this. But I would simply want to say for myself, although this is something that is related and I've certainly engaged with it for myself, I do not intend this to be the way in which we should stage any defence of the humanities. Quite the contrary, I would talk much more in the vein that both Mary and Bruce talked in passing in those comments. I think I'll stop there because then we'll have more time to let other people ask questions. Or display invective and rage as you wish.
Denunciation is okay.
Yeah, denunciation-ish.
Light. So does somebody moderate this, or we just have a free-for-all of silence?
I don't know if either of you want to. Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
This is a question about your book about the universities, but it's related. My question is, why do you publish it?
It's much worse than me.
So I couldn't hear the second phrase.
There were earlier pieces. They had their effect. Why republish them? And you know what I mean?
Well, wait a minute. I'm not sure if this is a genuinely inquiring question, which is slightly got something wrong, or it's a fundamental assault on my whole existence. That's to say, the greater part, the first half, which is the longer half of that book, had not been published, mostly at all, and some parts of the second half. And there were several pieces in the second half which had, and I made clear that I was republishing those. But, I mean, if the question is about did I think there was some polemical or persuasive gain, that I was hoping that putting those particular pieces of critique together with the more general account of the university in the first half of that book, then the answer is yes, I did. And I mean, it wouldn't be for me to say, and it would be hard for anyone to say, but certainly not for me to say whether that hope was justified or not. The book had all kinds of responses to it. But it was an attempt to situate, in some ways, the position from which I was making the criticisms in the specific pieces, that were, as you say, published before and reprinted in the second part of that book, in a more general account of the understanding of universities. Now, I mean, by all means, do come back and say I was wasting my time if you think that's the case.
No,
but
I like the book. Right. I wonder if you thought you would think it's about making a difference. You know, I'm sorry, I forgot that the first half was
right. That's
new.
yeah.
But the second half, why were those published? You know what I mean by that? Thatcher is dead. You know, that kind of thing. What kind of difference can the reprinted pieces make? Is what I'm asking.
Oh, well, maybe I'm not sure. Maybe you're also asking about something even larger here. I mean, which might be about reprinting pieces at all. I mean, we'd have to say that probably. I mean, I don't put my book on universities in this company, but a lot of the most interesting works of criticism in the last half century have been collections of largely reprinted pieces. Trilling, famously, would be a good example of this. Surely there is, in that particular case, a hope that there's something to gain from showing a pattern of criticism, because when somebody reads in a periodical just one piece, they don't have, as it were, the elaboration of that point of view to hand, and they don't have the example of the earlier instances to hand. And the fond author, at least, hopes that the cumulative effect of those put together is greater than the reading experience of somebody only reading any one of them. So, I mean, that would be the case, I think, usually, for trying to put something together to achieve that wider effect.
Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. I must admit, I really enjoyed it. There's something about the, almost the bravado of trying to defend Leavis and CP that was very pleasurable to me. I wonder whether, I think in a way I'm going to echo Bruce a little bit, because it seemed to me as if, even though clearly it seems right to say that you're not making a defense of the humanities, which seems like a sort of larger project which you've done elsewhere, it seems as if there's something at stake in the claim, something at stake in the connection between the two kind of claims that you're making, which I take to be, on the one hand, the tradition of cultural critique has been a critique of instrumentalism that hasn't articulated a clear alternative, and then the other kind of claim, which is that to the extent that it has, or rather one of its tactics, put it that way, perhaps not the only tactic, but one of the tactics which has a certain kind of long-term effectiveness is a sort of breach of etiquette that sort of puts into question the norms by which we establish sort of standing to speak And the second of those claims seems to me very plausible and right. And I echo Bruce, I suppose, in saying that it seems most familiar these days as a kind of deconstructive claim in a way. It's sort of like, I think of Barbara Johnson's sort of introduction to, Derrida and defense of that kind of style, which I know is not your territory style. But I wonder about the first claim, I guess I'm wondering what the relationship is between the first and the second claim, because the first claim seems problematic if we're looking at the history of, certainly there's a whole history of cultural criticism which does retreat into a kind of ineffability, if you want to call that a retreat. But there are other figures in the tradition who didn't do this, and in fact it seems like it's almost Raymond Williams' critique precisely of the sort of culture and society tradition, that it does repeatedly sort of retreat into that ineffability. And so if you consider him as a figure within the tradition, and you consider other figures that are sort of, more political, like Morris, for example, since we're around Ruskin, it seems as if characterizing the tradition in terms of a critique of instrumentality is perhaps not quite right, because even though they're definitely a critique of instrumentality, one only has to think of Morris's, the whole of Morris's work is sort of, nothing can be a work of art which is not useful, is sort of insistence on utility, and indeed Raymond Williams' critique of base and substructure, to start to think that in fact a critique at certain moments has gone beyond a critique of instrumentality, and it's just a critique of capitalism, which is a very different kind of critique, and then you're not, then the instrumental position is not forbidden to you. You might be able to say, as a person in critique, one can proceed into a kind of action. Anyway,
Okay,
it's a very long question.
it's a very good point, and it allows me also to try just to allude again to the point Bruce made about, in one respect, the term instrumentalism is a kind of empty category. I mean, anything can be instrumental for some other purpose, and it's not the fact that something serves a purpose in that way is obviously not a damning category that we use. I think you're absolutely right to say that what I've picked out here is, as I see, the kind of recurring element within what could be made a slightly more diverse tradition, if you want to call it tradition, but anyway, a diverse set of writings over these 150 years or more, which would include those who've wanted to engage in a more directly political critique of what is currently thought to be the prevailing dispensation in some way or other. I think that's right, and I think my paper doesn't deal, I should say more about that if I were doing it at more length, and I suspect I would not greatly disagree with what you and Bruce have hinted about that. I would only just say, though, since you both mentioned Raymond Williams in this connection, that when you reread the last chapter of Culture and Society, or when you reread his famous piece, Criticism is Ordinary, I can't help thinking you get some of the same gestures as in the people that I've been talking about. That when he is talking more directly about the failings of contemporary capitalism, he better instantiates the point you're making. When he, to some extent, stands back to offer something of his own as a gloss on the values that he sees coming from this tradition, or that he wants to keep alive and nourish from this tradition, I think he again moves into this sort of territory. And indeed, I suppose it's something that a second generation of political critics of Williams himself said. Those of you who know the New Left Review interviews with him are in a way saying that about some of his own writing. So although I've taken a strand, I think there are ways in which it's not so easy to escape that recurring pattern. I think that's the main thing I would say there. Can I just very quickly throw in also, because I think you raised it, but I forgot to mention it in answer to Bruce's comments, and it is another way of restating Mary's case for the humanities. I do not think, in what I'm saying here, since I'm not particularly talking about the humanities anyway, but I do not think more generally that it is a virtue to claim that one settles for uselessness, or to claim that there are various kinds of positions that don't have any utility. And that is not the case here at all. By suggesting the difficulty of giving voice, as it were, to the informing values of this tradition of criticism, I'm not saying that I think what they celebrate is uselessness, and I certainly don't intend to do that. But I think you were next.
You were very eloquent about what we believe as a profession, we value constructive criticism, we value conversation. Whenever someone tells me what we believe as a profession, I always ask, well, do you believe it personally? And the answer is invariably, no, I don't believe it personally, which makes me wonder who we are in this. It was fairly clear that in the defense of Leavis's tone, you don't believe it personally either, this constructive quality. Now, is there anyone who actually believes the kind of thing that who personally believes in the kind of thing that we believe professionally? And I wonder, if not, does that have something to do with why the humanities seem to be so indefensible? Because no one is saying what he or she means.
Right, well, we're getting on very wide-ranging territory here. And I see we're going to be talking about the humanities come what may.
The last part.
No, it's okay, it's fine. No, I mean, it exercises all of us. Maybe I'm not quite so wedded to sweet reasonableness as everybody keeps saying. I think I do believe in some of the virtue of the tactic that Leavis very self-consciously adopted there. Now, of course, it's in his case continuous with a tone that he uses on other occasions much more. Perhaps he can't altogether not use. And I'm not suggesting we have to write in that tone. But do I believe that a certain kind of calculated assault, a certain kind of anger in public debate by those of us who, by and large, spend our time in very measured statement, that a certain kind of excess doesn't at times have the merit of bringing home a position which, in straight propositional statement, is not going to be brought home? Yeah, I do. I do.
Trilling thought so too, by the way. His journals, he despises his whole public mode.
Yes, although you could, we could spend a long evening trying to find in his public mode an example of this kind of excess or this kind of direct passion. No. So, in the paper, I made one or two gentle allusions to Trilling's characteristic mode, and it has many virtues, including that of being seductive and often being fair-minded, perhaps sometimes a little oppressively fair-minded. But there are times, surely we would want to say, when we would have liked to see him, swing the hatchet a little bit more. And so, do I believe that this was a good time in Leavis's case? Yeah, I do. So I think, I'm back here.
Yeah. May I make a couple of propositions? Number one, there are all kinds of sciences, and there are all kinds of humanities studies. Proposition number two, therefore you cannot compare whole sciences as whole, and then humanities studies. In my opinion, some sciences are so awfully bad, we should speak loud, cry out, condemn them, like development of nuclear bombs. On the other hand, humanities should take very modest stand. We don't know many ultimate questions. Therefore, my third proposition is, we as a human being just pick bad sciences, condemn them, praise good, but similarly, not all people in humanities can be good. So, we have to be more selective, more careful. In short, there should be university to continue this search.
Okay.
The problem with all of you is that you seem to know what should be done immediately. I don't know. I'm just doing, because that's the only thing I can do well.
Okay.
And
Well,
compare.
right. Well,
Again, I will be very eloquent and strong in condemning bad sciences as well as sloppy.
Okay. No, I've got the point. But let me just say that I think it's been one of the deleterious effects of Snow's two cultures claim, insofar as that claim is attended to in detail, precisely to generate the idea that there is a kind of contrast of two uniform activities here, one called science, one called the humanities, although in fact Snow doesn't talk about the humanities in those terms. And that we do much better, and I've tried to say this in other writings on this topic, we do much better to pluralize our understanding of these things and that anyway, much of what is talked about, as I think in one of your examples in passing, is not actually the practice of the discipline of a particular science, but the application of science for various social or political purposes. So about that, I think there is no, not between you and I anyway, any disagreement that we should get away from those categories. Whether you think to talk about these things at all is to endorse some kind of binary thinking, well, that's a tricky issue. We use these labels and perhaps we can't get away from it. But I don't disagree with your central claim. Akil.
One last question.
Oh, sorry.
Second, Bruce asked you two mobilizing questions. One had to do with whether then you might distinguish between the sorts of things that Lewis was targeting, distinguish within them. So there's, on the one hand, questions of utility. On the other hand, there's science. And these are very different things. That's one of. And the other thing he mentioned was that there might be forms of usefulness which literature itself can make claims to, literary criticism. And these are not unrelated points of questions to raise for the sort of talk you gave. And I'm wondering if, in addressing it, this is a friendly remark.
That's always a very bad sign when somebody says that.
You can't tell.
If in addressing them, it might be worth pointing out that what Leavis is doing when he brings them together as things to target both utility and science is not science itself, but the outlook of science. And that utility presupposes a certain kind of detachment, which is preconditioned for instrumentality and so on, that you see the world, others and so on, from a detached view, and then see them as resources. And what criticism, even of the polemical kind that he does, is actually insist that there is a path of there's a path of engagement which refuses both. But the two aren't unconnected. So if there is going to be usefulness, it won't be the usefulness that presupposes a certain kind of detachment that comes with a form of engagement. And it's the engagement that he's really stressing, just as he's stressing life and so on and other things. And so there may be a way of...
Yeah, no, that's very well put. Thank you. I think on the general point that what's being both illustrated and in a way recommended by Leavis, not just in this piece, but more generally in the polemics that he writes about the role of the teaching of literature, is really what I was pointing to when I said that he disowned academicism, that there is, he thinks there a kind of sham impersonality, that there is an attempt at a certain sort of detachment about matters about which we should not be detached. And so it is in some ways an incitement to passion, to actual direct human response to these things that he wants the teaching of literature to encourage us to do. And that's right. So I think that's a very good way to connect those things. The only thing I would say, though, about your first of the 2 points is not how I would put it. That is that I don't, in this piece of Leavis's, I don't really read him as criticizing science, even in terms of its detachment necessarily. It's quite surprising, I think, given the reputation of the piece, that he says so little about science. And that the one or two things he says about it as a category just like that are actually rather positive, including that he thinks Snow doesn't demonstrate the kind of rigour and the kind of engagement with theoretical reasoning that sciences, most of the natural sciences, do so exhibit. So I think it's much more to do with the matters that I mentioned earlier about the ways in which, because he's assumed to know about these things, Snow has acquired a certain standing and is treated therefore as a sage. So it's that mechanism that Leavis wants to uncover in some ways. And then it is the unquestioning suggestion, the unquestioning endorsement of economic prosperity as not just what the application of technology could bring, but as the measure of the human good. And I think that is not so much about detachment, really, although I quite see how still he wants to make the case for giving voice to certain other kinds of human values. But I think that is in part about the, as he sees it, the trivialization of public debate about this. The phrase he quotes, picks up and of course plays with from Snow is, you know, what progress amounts to is jam today and more jam tomorrow. And it's that kind of triviality, I think, that he's really exercised by, not that Snow is speaking in the voice of science, really. Apparently we have to stop.
I think we should thank our guests. I think we could easily go